Executive compensation has a very broad spectrum from functional assessment all the way to pension funds. And I wanted to focus on what is relevant for board members. However, I exclude all the legal aspects. I'm focusing only on what is relevant to steer the company. And we start with the first exercise, which is we hire a CEO. And Gregor has volunteered to be your new CEO. I think you have gone through an extensive search, and the head of the corporate governance school at the HSG is now your preferred candidate. And what you have to do is you have to make him an offer how much to pay. So for a company your size that you're managing, the median pay is 450,000, which is denoted here in the box plot as the horizontal blue line. There's a lower quartile, an upper quartile of 380,000 and an upper quartile of 600,000. The highest paid CEOs, the top decile, is paid 850,000, and there are a couple that receive only 290,000 for a comparable position. This is a very realistic exercise. This happens in board. They're getting these benchmarks, and they have to make an offer to the CEO. I think these are all very valid reasons. I think it's very representative of what actually happens in boards when they hire a CEO. Would you agree, Georg?
Absolutely.
Now, the interesting thing is what happens to your pay in the market. The median actually increases by 11% from 450 to 500. Very interesting. The top comes down from 850 to 610. This is the top decile that we have offered. And very interesting, the lowest salary that was offered was 430, so you have a pay increase of 48%. The important point I want to make here is that this process of hiring and paying a CEO in itself can be the reason why CEO pay spirals, as we observe in the market. The problem is that all the boards have the same challenge as you. They have to be generous to the new executives, and that's why salaries go up. CEO pay only spirals because it can be benchmarked. We've done empirical exercise about 10 years ago with a HSG student, and we looked at what people would typically pay to CEOs, and the average pay increase that we measured over 300 people that participated was that the median increases by 23%. So it's a lot, and boards have to be very careful. Do not benchmark too much, or then do not go above the median too much to not accelerate the spiraling pay. And I have a blog on LinkedIn where I wrote the exercise down and also the results. When we did that research with 300 people, we asked them about the math grade to identify if people that are numerically skilled, more skilled, are better at this effect, or like are a little bit more protected against the wage anchor effect. And it turns out that no matter how good you are in math, your average wage anchor effect, your average wage increase is about the same. If you go from 4 to 5, the wage anchor effects actually increase. And if we're very bad at math, assuming they answered honestly, it was actually lower. So the math skill alone can't help you as a proxy for intelligence. But what can help you, that's good news for the women here, women are less affected of the wage anchor effect. When we looked at what women offered, their offer was still significant, but lower, by a third lower than what men offered. Very interesting side effect, which then helped me write a LinkedIn article, which was a little bit attention-grabbing. There's also another effect that I looked at, which I found really fascinating. We also asked what happens if you hire lower-skilled people. So if you have benchmark information for your babysitter or for your household staff, and it turns out the wage anchor effect is not as large, but it's still there. So at that point, then I thought it would actually be good to have better benchmarks for lower skilled people, because that would help them increase their wages. And I'm now working on an idea which I call the public paycheck. is to put wage information on a blockchain so that even low-skilled people can benchmark their pay and may actually get paid a higher salary, which I think is a market-efficient way of increasing salaries and therefore much more effective than minimum pay. An interesting side effect is that the lower paid profit the most and the higher paid actually get a reduction in pay. So when you look at the deciles, the worst paid increased their wage. You have seen that here too. There was nobody at 290. It was a significant increase at the lower end. So the lower skilled people had the highest wage increase. So when you ask them about setting a pay level for a lower skilled person, nobody wants to really pay below the median. They want to be closer to the median and not really very much below. But even executives get a wage increase that is way higher than the median. And the better people are paid, the less the wage effect actually increases. So with pay benchmarking information, you will see less outliers. So in Switzerland, after the compensation law came into effect, the Minder law came into effect, very extreme high pay levels have not been seen anymore. Question for you, why does Elon Musk get 2 billion in pay or Tim Cook gets 500 million? Any ideas why this is the case? I have also an opinion. I don't know if it's true, but I think the high pay level makes them a celebrity. So they are already good. We all know Tim Cook was a really good CEO or manager, and we also know that Elon Musk was a really talented entrepreneur. By giving them 500 million or 2 billion, it puts them into the stratosphere. And I think maybe one reason why they pay so much is because they have the necessity to communicate that this CEO is a god. I think that could be part of the creation of a unique personality where people then all believe in that person and follow them. Now we're coming to the question of pay for performance, and it's going to be mostly about pay for performance today. And the first exercise is, let's assess performance. What actually is a good performance? And I've provided for you a small exercise. The exercise comes from an actual company. I simplified the numbers so that they're not confusing. But these are the 4 metrics that are the most important in performance-based contracts. So what year was the best year?
Year 6.
Year 6, okay. Why year 6?
Because they had a good profit margin level. It's the second best profit margin. They also have a 45% increase in profits. And that means that the earnings per share will be also great. And it's the biggest size of the company they reach in this period of time. And also they have a good sales growth.
Okay. Other opinions? Yes?
We say year 5 is best in performance. Year 6 has highest sales. And year 2 also, compared year 1 was really good. But year 5, we saw sales growth coming from -6 to 17. And that is the biggest gap we've seen between the years since year 1. So
Okay.
based on year-to-year performance, that's the best year.
There's an economic point of view which is typically not mentioned. The increase in profit is the highest in year 4. So if you believe that value of the company is the most important thing, then year 4 would be the economic point of view. The most important thing here is that we can't agree on performance. This is the important thing, because if we cannot agree on performance, how can we define milestones or metrics to actually pay based on performance? You can't just go and look at the financial numbers and know what the answer is. Financial numbers are actually quite dangerous as an indicator to maximize. And we depend on them for pay for performance. Profit percent sales was mentioned in year 6 as one of the metrics. And I'd like to make a deep dive here on the return metric. Let's assume we have a simple corporation. They have two products, an orange and an apple. And let's say oranges have a margin of 20% and apples have 10%. And the question to you is, what can you do to actually improve the profit margin? Reduce cost, yes. Increase sales. So what is the sneaky answer? You have now a compensation, pay for performance. It's based on profit margin and you want to increase the profit margin. What do you do?
Stop selling.
Right, stop selling B. The implication is in a company with many products where it's not so transparent, what you should do. If profit margins are your pay relevant metric, what you do is you're selling high margin products and you forget the low margin products. And that's actually against the interest of the company. You wouldn't have, built Walmart based on high profit margins. You can also make a profit from products that have small profit margins. There's still a two whatever profit that is going to be lost if you stop doing B. You could increase the sales of A. The point I would like to make is that it's sufficient to just not do B to increase your pay. And this is a wrong incentive in large corporations where they have products with different margins. Because even the low margin products may provide a return. Now, when we go a step further and we look at the return metrics, ROIC, RONOA, ROCE, they're different names for the same thing. You divide the profit by an investment, by the capital, and you get a return metric. The problem with these metrics is, if you do nothing, if you just invest, they increase because depreciation takes your investment down. And when you decide to do something, maybe invest again for something new, they decrease. So ROIC, which by now is a really popular metric, I just looked at the compensation plan of Henkel, and it's 80% of their long-term incentive plan. 80% is ROIC. Provides the message, don't invest. Because if you invest, you actually get punished by the metric. Typically, people come up and say economic profit solves that. Economic profit has the advantage that it actually shows you the change from the previous year. You can look at it that way. And it's a better performance indicator than a return on investment. But it has the exact same problem. Whenever you invest, your economic profit will fall. I came across this problem after I advocated for economic profit-based compensation plans, even in the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, when I visited wine and beer bottle producer Vetropack, and the CFO told me EVA or economic profit doesn't work for them because they have these huge basins where they melt glass, and these basins are out of concrete. Building such a basin costs a lot of money, and it lives for about 20 years. So for 20 years, this basin gets smaller and smaller and smaller because the hot glass dissolves it. And after 20 years, you need to make a new basin. And he told me that, look, my economic profit increases for 20 years until when I do a new basin, it dramatically drops. I can't use it. And this is the first time I realized that economic profit is actually also not panacea. What we did is we analyzed companies with heavy reliance on profit metrics and companies that have a broader range of metrics that use growth as well and other metrics. And we found that in the year 2014, when we did that the first time, we even published it in the NZZ am Sonntag, that companies that have a broad, only profit-related metrics, the red ones, they perform worse on all aspects. Not just revenues, you also make less profit, and you have worse shareholder returns. It turned out then that, 2 years later, 6 companies still had an exclusive profit focus. Only 34% of the companies, only 1/3, had also revenue metrics in there. We did another article in the NZZ am Sonntag, this time naming and shaming the companies, and that actually had an effect. Because then, 5 years later, now 60% have a broader mix of metrics in the Swiss market. Recently, I looked at a number of companies where we pitched our services, and I looked at how important growth metrics are. to balance the profit metrics. And you can see that the growth metrics, which I put in green, are really limited in impact for these companies. The very red one are the ROIC metrics, the return metrics, and the other ones are profit metrics. They're also red. And you can see that if you look at the average is of revenue, of growth incentives in compensation contracts today is only 20%, and the rest actually is profit. PwC, with whom I work closely together, analyzed all Swiss companies and came to exactly the same conclusion. So even today, profit dominates executive pay, despite the problems I've mentioned. The point I want to make here is profit is a really bad performance metric. What people forget is that investments take time. The hockey stick. If there's a hockey stick in your business, you cannot use profit or return metrics as metrics because they assume that you make a profit right away. Otherwise, why should managers or executives invest?
What you see here is the typical hockey stick graph for any new investment. Whenever people do a business plan, they will show you the hockey stick. So the cash flow first goes down because there's an investment and it needs to be recuperated until it hits a corner and it goes back up, and eventually it should actually be a lot higher than at the beginning. That's the justification of the investment. Now, when you link profit to executive pay, you assume the dotted line. You assume that from the time you do the investment, there is an immediate profit right from start. And that's just not realistic.
Now you actually split up and we talk about target setting. There are 4 different groups and you work in your group. Group A is an industry average history. It's an actual history. Nicole did the analysis. Group B is a company. Group C is another industry average. And Group D is a company. One takes the role of the CEO and one takes the role of the board. And you have to negotiate a target. It's really hard to negotiate a target. It takes a lot of work.
Try this exercise yourself. You have here the charts that we showed to the group for group A, B, C, and D. And, think about what target you would set. Let's pick group A, setting a target here for group A. You can see that in year 13, they had a growth rate of 14.8. In the current year, it's minus 4.5. So it must be somewhere in between. Maybe we pick, 6%, as something in between those numbers, a little bit on the lower end. But if we look at the historic years, the year 8, 9, and 10, it was around 6%. So this seems to be not a bad level if you have this industry information as your guide. If you're group B, you could come to the conclusion that 6% might actually be a little high. Only 2 years, year 14 and year 3 reached this target of 6%. In the year 13, it was higher than 6%. Other years, it's lower. So maybe more a target around 4% is correct. We have the year 9 and 10 where the company achieved 4.3% growth, 4.7% growth. So this seems to be like a logical performance target for that year. Now try to do that yourself. Try to think by looking at these graphs what the target would be that you would set for the company based on either industry information, which is group A and C, or on company historic information, which is group B and D. Afterwards, I will show you what the class said, what the numbers were that the class came up, that they used for a target in their compensation plan. And then you can compare your target that you're setting with the targets of them. So do it and come up with your number, and let's see how your number compares to the others.
And I'm now really curious to see what the result is of your target compared to the history. Very good. I'm really relieved. The median was 1.9 for the group A, and you negotiated a median target of 4.3. For group B, it was 0.3 was the median. You negotiated 5.5 median. And group D, you had a median of 1.1 and you negotiated a target of 3%. The percentile rank of your target is down here. So group A set the target in the 75th percentile rank of the history. Group B did it in the 84th percentile rank, thank you to the 10%, which I think, by the way, is the most realistic. Nobody will do a 3% target in a corporate environment. I must say, nobody does a 1%, even though it makes sense. It makes absolute sense. That would have been a median performance, roughly. But you cannot do it. Basically, it's just impossible. You have to set a growth target at least at 5%. And the last group also had a percentile rank of 79%, which means you only have a 20% chance to reach your target. And this is an important message. It happens in every corporation. They're all overconfident. They look at the history and they don't do what they have to do, take the median of the past. It's the only rational thing to do and have a reason why you deviate from the median. But we cannot do it. And even if somebody does it, like you, because you may have read Daniel Kahneman, even if you do it, you would never be able in a corporate environment to get that through. Because if you have a 1% growth target, you would probably have to set your floor at minus 10% or minus 20, to be kind of more or less reliable. It's virtually impossible to do a growth-based compensation plan that works well, because you cannot say minus growth is still a good performance. And you cannot say that your maximum is reached at 20-30% growth, which you would have to do in order to cover the volatility that actually exists in growth numbers. Let's go first into the question of sales growth. We identified that sales growth is an important metric to balance the cost-cutting impact of profit metrics. And I have another exercise for you, where you can again in the same group briefly discuss. Let's say you know that the average growth is 8% for an industry. You know that. And you have now to design a bonus system where 8% is your target. Where would you set the payout hurdle below which you're not getting any pay? And where would you set the payout cap? So this is what we have. The average of your answers for the floor is 7%, the median is 6%, and the cap is at 12%, median average is the same. The problem is the distribution, was already mentioned. The problem with this is, when you look at the distribution, for these largest companies of Germany, we have 755 observations, and between 4 and 14%, because I had to kind of use the numbers that were already said, there are only a third of the companies. So only a third of the companies are within that range. And your range is actually even narrower. 2/3 are either higher or lower. And that's a big problem, because it means in 2/3 of the cases, there's no incentive to grow. If you can't reach the hurdle, you're kind of like, okay, I'm doing this next year, and I move my business to next year. If you've already made your cap, you again move your business to next year. And this is a big challenge, because ideally we would know the distribution. We would say like, it goes from somewhere below 10% to somewhere above 25%. And we just design the curve like this. And I actually had one answer from an actuary at Swiss Re who had a very broad range. Now, what is the problem with the broad range? Everybody will laugh at you. If you tell your executives, if you just grow minus 10%, you already get a bonus. And if you want to have the maximum, you have to grow more than 25%. For a large German company that grows 8% on average, people will just simply laugh at you. It's actually not possible to take the distribution into account. You simply cannot design a sales component in your pay for performance scheme that works well. The solution is to combine this information, to combine the company and industry. And when you combine this, it already is a lot better because you can now see when you're better than the industry and when you're worse. You can actually eliminate the numbers once you have a graphic. We add the first quartile and the third quartile. So 50% of all companies are within that blue shaded area. And now you have a method of setting a growth target which is extremely reliable. You just say you have to be better than the market. There is a professor, Bengt Holmström, who received this Nobel Prize for saying you should do executive compensation relative to peers because there's always an information deficit for outsiders, including boards. And with the information principle, he called it that way, he could mathematically prove that you have to use market information and you should not negotiate a target. We built the company on relative performance measurement, and our first customer was Sika. And those that are Swiss may know Sika. It's an extremely successful construction supplier. And they came to us in 2009, were our first customer for relative performance measurement, because they have such ambitious growth targets that they said it's not fair to link our pay to those targets. And for them, it was obvious that they have to be paid relative to the market. But also on top of that, it retains your incentive even in a down market. When you remember, this was actually a minus performance, the minus 3.0, but it's better than the median. So even when the market crashes, you still have an incentive to outperform. If you have absolute targets, there's no incentive down here. There's no incentive down here. There's no incentive all the way up here. There's no incentive. Another thing that is really good if you measure relative to peers, you can use percentile ranks. So if you beat 25%, you get a certain pay, 50%, you get target pay. And you can make a very simple curve that depends on the peers. You don't have the problem anymore that you have areas where people simply say, let's wait for next year, because every improvement this year is going to give you more money. Unfortunately, the proxy advisors don't see it that way. They want to start paying at the median. That's what the proxy advisors want. They kind of say like, we only want to give a bonus if you're better than the market. What's the problem with what the proxy advisors want if you look at this curve?
It's either that people might try to mix the numbers in order to get to that 50% to get the target pay. And also they're not incentivized. If they're in the 25 and they know they cannot reach the 50, they will not do the extra effort.
I agree with both points. The first point was Enron. If the targets are too high, people start to cheat. And the second one is, in 50% of all cases, there's no incentive to grow. Is there another one? Could you think of another? Yes? If I'm a CEO, I'm getting half. The area below the curve is what you get paid on average. It's half of this. Basically, in 50% of the cases, you get an average of 100% pay, which is only half pay, which means you have to watch double the pay, which means your pay fluctuates a lot more than it should. So basically, what proxy advisors want, they want more risk in the pay, which is completely stupid. You don't want more risk because then people start to cheat. You don't want more risk because then people are demotivated in the down part. So, you really don't want that. But proxy advisors want this, and companies sometimes now do this, which is still a little bit the same problem. Still 50% of the cases are not paid. And what we do now with the companies that use our method or relative performance measurement for long-term incentive plans, we use a curve that starts at the 25th percentile and tops at the 75th percentile. If you measure 3 metrics 3 times, if you have 9 measurements, there's a high likelihood that you have a couple here, and the average then will actually be within the area that pays well. I did the analysis when I was really enthusiastic about relative performance measurement, and what I did is we looked at performance in terms of percentile ranks. So 100% peers are outperformed beat, and then this is the millions that people got. This is in the US. There is almost no R-square, and you can see it's all over the place. It was actually such a surprise that we even got quoted in The Economist. We also did it for the UK. This is now the United Kingdom. And again, we were invited by BBC because it was so new. We also did for Switzerland. At that point, I lost interest because there's still really no correlation. And over the time, I found other correlations two. Here is Bloomberg. That was in 2014. Again, no correlation. They actually took that down. Here you could actually click on the dots at Bloomberg and you could see the CEO, their performance and their pay. This was something more recent from The Economist in 2017, based on data from MSCI. Again, no correlation. Here they say accumulated compensation is now on the horizontal axis and shareholder return on the vertical axis, but it doesn't matter where you put the axis, there's no correlation. Now, the interesting thing is CEOs don't care about pay performance. They're not saying, if I get paid more, I work harder. So your assumption that they actually would work more is not really borne out by the practice. Most CEOs will actually tell you, I don't care about pay, I just want to be paid fairly. And the big problem is fair pay means benchmarking, and then their pay goes up. So for me, the most important message is really in CEO compensation. Pay for performance is not about motivating executives. It's about compensating them for what you want from them. There are a couple of professors that advocate fixed pay. It's one of the solutions that has been discussed in the answer set quite a few times. But that would actually mean you're paying the CEO to just be in the role. You would not pay them for something that you actually want from them. You could pay them for time, as you do for normal employees. Doesn't make sense. So when you pay them for things you want from them, you actually say, I cannot control the executives, but I want from them revenues, I want returns, I want profits, I want to reach strategic milestones, I want them to run an efficient, excellent company, to minimize risk, environmental risk, social risk, legal risk. I want them to minimize risk. So when you link pay to all those factors, you will not get a lot of variability. So executives will not see their pay jump dramatically, but they will be aware that all these things matter. This is again the M, that is the full performance story. Because you name what is important to you, maybe the 12 most important facts, you also look at them. And when then one of these facts goes down, you become early aware that there is a problem. And this is my solution to executive pay today, not fixed pay, pay for performance, but based on a broad range of criteria. Now, my solution that I have is this. Don't only look at half the performance story. Half of the performance story is basically a profit and loss statement. Include also all the non-financial performance indicators. And the way I group them today is that I say there are indicators for your strategy, non-financial. Do you reach a certain milestone? You set milestones. Concrete, product launches in the market, but then also business excellence, your failure rates, your returns, efficiency of your production line. And then what is called ESG, I prefer to call it stakeholder risk, because these are actually risk metrics. ESG also has a role there. And then you can extend your performance story from just the profit to a much broader performance picture. The reason why profit is such a problem is that quite a few of the costs that you deduct are actually partly an investment into the future. So when you look at profits, it's not clean. It is not just this period. Production costs and administration costs is probably, really just that period. But other costs that are deducted could be investments. And by representing those investments on the right side of the graph, you have a much broader performance story.